Now in chapter 3, simply another historical chapter recording the story of the 3 Hebrew children in the fiery furnace. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image about 12.5 feet by 125 feet high. Quite an image. Stood it out in the plain of Dura, and he made a law that all who would listen to the music would have to bow down to that God and recognize that as God. So he called all the people together, and they stood before him, and he laid down the law to them, definitely told them what he required, and the trumpets began to sound, the music began to play, and all the people bowed down before the king, with the exception of 3 boys, 3 Jewish boys, or men by this time. And I do not know why Daniel was not mentioned in this connection. He was somewhere around, evidently, because I know he was still alive, maybe on some far-flung business for his king. At any rate, these men refused to bow down. And the counselors reported to the king that there were some Jews, captives of Judah, that refused to obey the king's command. And so he was wroth and demanded them to bow down or else. And that else was to be cast into a furnace of fire. They wouldn't do it. And he said, "Is your God whom you serve able to deliver you?" They said, "Yes, he is. If not, that's all right with us. We will not bow down to the idol." It had been written in the law of Moses many centuries before, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me, and thou shalt not bow down to any graven image or any likeness of anything in heaven above or on the earth or underneath here." And these boys were going to die for their faith if need be. So the music began to play. The test was on. These boys stood straight as a soldier and refused to bow down. And the king was mad, exceedingly wroth, and he commanded the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than for anybody else. In fact, one of the apocryphal books, you know, those 14 books between the Old and New Testaments in your old family Bibles, one of those books called the Book of Bel tells us that the flame shot up from the top of that furnace 45 cubits high. That's almost 75 feet high. Higher than this church here. Flames shooting up. The flames were so intense that it killed immediately the men who threw them in the fiery furnace. Didn't affect those Hebrew boys, though, because their God was able to deliver. And so the king began to look in there and see the frying flesh, and he didn't see anything of that nature. His eyes were open, and he was so astonished. And he called his counselors together and said, "Did not we put just 3 in there? I see 4. And the form of the 4th is like a son of God." So the story goes how that they were commanded to come out of that fire. Their bonds were burnt so they could come out all right. They couldn't walk in because they were bound. They were thrown in. But they could walk out all right. And we read there wasn't a smell of smoke on their clothes. Not even a smell of fire on their clothing. There wasn't one hair singed. There wasn't any effect at all of that fire upon those Hebrew boys. I don't know where the 4th fellow went to, but the 3 of them came out of the furnace. And the king then made a decree that all peoples must serve the God of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. Now that's the gist of the story of chapter 3. Chapter 4 is another vision of Nebuchadnezzar. It is a vision that he had after serving many years. In fact, some tell us that this was about 40 years after the vision of chapter 2. I do not know, it does not say. But at any rate, the king had another dream. And this time he didn't forget the dream like he did in chapter 2. He saw a great tree that just grew to the height of heaven and spread over all the earth, so that all the beasts of the field could get under its branches, and it brought forth fruit to feed everything that was under it and in its branches. And then he saw a watcher come down from heaven with an axe or something to cut the tree down, and he hewed the tree down to the ground and just left the stump in the ground. And yet there was just a band of iron, as it were, around the stump. Now the king was disturbed about this dream also, so he called the same wise men, or their descendants at least, and demanded of them to tell him the dream. I mean the interpretation of the dream, not the dream, just the interpretation. They couldn't do that. In the first dream, he demanded the dream as well as the interpretation. But this time, he demanded the interpretation only. They couldn't do it. So Mr. Daniel was called again, and he told the king the story. We read that Daniel was astonished for about 1 long hour. He didn't know what to think. His eyebrows knitted and his eyes got narrow, and he didn't know what in the world to think. He loved that king more or less by this time. He had been good to him, and he saw that it concerned the enemies of the king. And the king spoke to him and said, "Don't let your countenance be so." Said, "What does it mean?" Well, he said, "The dream concerns your enemies." Said, "The tree represents you, just like the head of gold in chapter 2 represented the king Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom." Said, "You are the one represented by the tree. You have made a great kingdom. This kingdom is spread out all over the earth, and there isn't anything but what is protected and fed by your wonderful power and glory." And he said, now, the watcher represents the fact that your kingdom is going to be taken away from you. The tree is going to be cut down. Your kingdom is going to be taken away from you. And they, your enemies, shall drive you from your kingdom, and you will eat grass with the beasts of the field for 7 long years. And then your kingdom will be restored to you again, just represented by the root still being left in the ground. So after a full year, King Nebuchadnezzar was walking in his palace. His heart was uplifted. He didn't take Daniel's advice at all. Daniel had told him that if he would humble himself and do that was right, perhaps God would stay the judgment for a while. But he didn't take heed. His heart was lifted up beyond measure. And he suddenly became insane and imagined that he was a beast of the field. And they drove that insane man out into the field with the beasts. And he stayed in the field day and night. He ate grass with the oxen. And we read that the hair of his head became like bird's feathers, and his fingernails became like bird claws. They looked at that old King Nebuchadnezzar out in the field for 12 long months, or 7 long years. And then at the end of that time, suddenly his reason came back to him, and he was restored to his kingdom. And another time he blessed the God of heaven and gave glory to him who was able to do all things, and who was able to reveal such divine secrets, and who was able to bring them to pass. Then we have in chapter 5 the story of Daniel interpreting a vision or of a handwriting on the wall. This time King Nebuchadnezzar was dead. Belshazzar, his grandson, was on the throne. Nebuchadnezzar, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, was then fighting with the Medes and Persians in another part of the empire. Belshazzar, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, was left in the city of Babylon in charge. The Persian armies under Cyrus was already surrounding the city. They were already cutting the channel of the river Euphrates to flow around the city so they could get under those brazen gates without any trouble. All this was going on the outside. Seemingly no one knew anything about it. Yet they should have known about it. They had such a drunken party on the inside of the palace. 1,000 of his lords were gathered together from all parts of the empire, and they were certainly making merry. And suddenly there appeared a hand right on the wall. and wrote Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. And he was troubled. He called the wise men, the astrologers, the soothsayers, and all the Chaldeans and the magicians and so on, and they could not read the handwriting on the wall. So they called Daniel. Belshazzar was informed that there was a man of the captives of Judah that had interpreted strange dreams and visions for his grandfather or father, as in your version, Nebuchadnezzar. So Daniel was called. The reward was a chain of gold about the neck and great riches, and to become a third ruler in the kingdom, if the man would interpret this dream to the satisfaction of king, or rather the ruler Belshazzar. Daniel said, let your gifts be to you and to another, but I will make known to the king what the handwriting means. And so he started in. Mene, you are weighed in the balances and are found wanting. Tekel, your kingdom is divided, given to the Medes and Persians. In other words, there were three words here interpreted, three different ideas. You're found in the balance, your kingdom has come to an end, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. And we read the last two verses of this chapter, that Belshazzar was slain that very night. And Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years of age. Now that's the story of chapter 5. Chapter 6, another historical chapter, concerns Daniel in the lion's den. And no doubt all of you know the story of Daniel, how that he was put in the lion's den. And the reason for this was the enemies of Daniel who were under him. Daniel was placed over all the presidents and all the king's counselors throughout the realm. The highest exalted man, in fact, the prime minister. And so these under him thought that they would find some occasion against Daniel concerning his religion. They heard him pray day and night, 3 times a day, as your Bible tells you. They heard that voice going out to the God of heaven. They began to think, well, I think we have finally ran across a way to get even with Daniel. Let us go to the king and ask him to make a law that for 30 days there will be no one worship any other god or ask any request of anybody but you, O king. And so naturally that struck the heart of the king. He was full of pride anyway. And so he thought, well, that'd be a good idea. Everybody will have to recognize me and bow down to me, and everybody will have to request everything from me for 30 long days. So he said, okay, and he signed it, put his seal on it, and the law of the Medes and Persians, as we read here, cannot be altered. So these fellows, the enemies of Daniel, went around to see if he's going to pray to his God as usual. Daniel didn't make a bit of difference with him. He opened those windows wide, threw the doors wide open, got down on his face before God and began to cry out to the God of heaven 3 times a day, just as if nothing ever happened. Now, it takes grace to do things like that. You've got to have religion, not a professional. And so there he was praying. They were sneaking on the outside to see if he's going to pray as usual. Yes, there he starts. So they went to the king and said, Mr. King, your prime minister, he doesn't pay any attention to your laws. He doesn't care for you at all. Come over here and we'll show you that he's praying to another god. And he's asking requests from the God of heaven. And you have signed a law that only you could be prayed to for 30 days. And so the king naturally had to enforce the law. So he called Daniel and asked him, what about it? Is your God able to deliver you from the lion's den? And you said, certainly. I've been in touch with him a good many years now, and he's able to do anything. So the king, contrary to his own wishes, he loved Daniel and wanted to spare him. He threw him in the lion's den, and we read of an angel coming down and shutting the lion's mouth. And Daniel had a good snooze all night long. In the morning early, the king came by after spending a sleepless night. And he came by, looked in, he said, Daniel, is your God able to deliver you? Has he delivered you? Yes, O king, we're all right. We've been having a good time all night long down here. And so the king commanded the enemies of Daniel to be thrown in the lion's den. Daniel came out and was exalted. Higher still by the king Darius, the king of the Medes and Persians. That's the story of chapter 6.